This video discussion is about physostigmine, corresponding to Antidotes in Depth Chapter A11 in Goldfrank's Toxicologic Emergencies. The learning objectives for this session are that you'll be able to describe the indications and contraindications for antidotal physostigmine and be able to outline a dosing regimen when using physostigmine. Although, as we'll see at the end of this discussion, as this recording is being made in early 2024, this might be a moot point. Physostigmine is a carbamate, and it has the same mechanism as the carbamate insecticides of inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, therefore making it an indirect cholinergic agonist. Any signal from acetylcholine released into synapses is normally turned off by the action of acetylcholinesterase, which hydrolyzes the ester bond, turning the acetylcholine into a molecule of acetate and a molecule of choline. There are other similar therapeutic carbamates available, but what makes physostigmine special is that the drug is uncharged and better penetrates the blood-brain barrier into the CNS, compared, say, to neostigmine or pyridostigmine, which are used for myasthenia gravis, to increase the amount of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. And since myasthenia gravis is a peripheral, which is to say non-central nervous system disease, the fact that those drugs are charged and do not enter the CNS well is a good thing, so we can avoid potential CNS side effects. Physostigmine, as a cholinomimetic agent, can reverse peripheral antimuscarinic effects. But since it can enter the CNS, it can also have antidotal action against central antimuscarinic toxicity, the confusion and delirium that can be seen in the anticholinergic toxidrome. In fact, the common trade name for physostigmine in the US is antilirium, since it has anti-delirium effects. In the past, physostigmine had been suggested and used for general CNS arousal effects in patients with depressed mental status after overdoses of several substances, and it can have some beneficial effect. Physostigmine had also been recommended to reverse antimuscarinic effects seen with cyclic antidepressant overdose, as covered in my other video discussion in this series. These indications, however, are no longer advised, and several recommendations state that a prolonged QRS duration on the EKG, which could be a sign of sodium channel blockade from cyclic antidepressants, is an absolute contraindication to using physostigmine. When physostigmine is given, it could, of course, push the balance of cholinergic to anticholinergic too far, so these patients should be closely monitored, like actually with a cardiac monitor and pulse oximetry, and with close bedside attendance of the persons ordering and administering the drug, watching for bradycardia, hypoxia, adverse pulmonary effects, seizures, etc. You should think twice with patients who have heart block, obstructive pulmonary disease, and urinary outlet obstruction before giving physostigmine, since the drug can make those things worse. Lots of patients with anticholinergic poisoning will have urinary retention as part of the toxidrome, so insertion of a Foley catheter would be advised. So we've got an antidote, and antidotes are potentially therapeutic, but the best use of physostigmine may be as a diagnostic tool to confirm antimuscarinic poisoning. Let's say you have a patient with altered mental status that you think might be from antimuscarinic poisoning. If you give them physostigmine and their altered mental status, their delirium, does not improve, then you need to continue a diagnostic workup, which is likely to include a head CT, maybe a lumbar puncture, MRI, EEG, and a whole slew of other lab tests. But if you give them physostigmine and the patient's mental status improves, and it's happened to me that a patient basically woke up about a minute after getting physostigmine, started talking normally, and said they had indeed overdosed on Benadryl and were feeling much better now. If you can confirm the reason the patient had altered mental status, then you can avoid that $1 million workup. Physostigmine's effects don't last very long, and the patient may become delirious again. But now you know what the reason is, having avoided a lot of cost and effort, and can treat the patient with sedatives like benzodiazepines instead as needed, which might be safer since they don't cause bradycardia, heart block, exacerbate obstructive pulmonary disease, or potentially induce seizures. If you're going to use physostigmine, per the chapter recommendations, it's given in a dose of 1 to 2 milligrams IV over at least 5 minutes. Kids get 0.02 milligrams per kilogram up to a maximum of 0.5 milligram. What I typically do is drop 2 milligrams as my maximum dose and give 0.5 milligram aliquots every few minutes while standing at the bedside and directly observing the effects. I'll be talking to the patient even if initially they're off in their own hallucinatory world, and when they start responding and making sense, I know that it's working. A major potential downside of physostigmine is its short duration of action. While physostigmine's half-life is about 16 minutes, we will often see good clinical effect for an hour or a bit more. But since many of the anticholinergic agents we're treating last a lot longer than that, it's fairly likely the patient will get altered again as the physostigmine wears off. And then you have to make the decision whether to redose physostigmine and accept the associated risks, although those risks are minimized by close monitoring and careful dose titration. Or you may wish to control any recurrence of agitation with other means, such as benzos. Here's a great published example of what physostigmine can do for a patient with moderate antimuscarinic CNS effects. The patient was initially asked to draw a clock face, which is a standard part of an extended neurologic examination. The patient drew an okay-ish circle and then put in the numbers, starting at 12 and then wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5, ham and beans. 5 minutes after getting 0.5 milligrams physostigmine, the patient was able to draw much more accurately and without any ham or beans, and 5 minutes after a second dose, they made a nearly perfect clock face. I like giving physostigmine when it's indicated because the rapidity and completeness of fixing the altered mental status almost looks like magic. Here's a photograph, though, of what was happening an hour later. This patient arrived with moderately altered mental status and looked anticholinergic. He responded well to physostigmine and was able to give a clear history of his Benadryl ingestion with an intention for self-harm. But the physostigmine wore off, and I took this photo as we were waiting for more sedative meds to arrive at the bedside. At the risk of adversely dating this recording, there is currently no source of new physostigmine in the United States. The only physostigmine manufacturer went bankrupt in 2023 and production ceased. Since then, a number of toxicologists have been looking for an alternative. It's got to be something that gets into the central nervous system. Rivastigmine, which is used to improve mentation for dementia associated with Alzheimer or Parkinson's disease, is being used and people are reporting their results. A big limitation here is that rivastigmine is not available in an IV formulation, and it can be hard to get patients with an altered mental status to take oral meds. There's also transdermal patches, which have the obvious limitation of slower onset time and no fine titration of effect possible. So it was great talking about physostigmine, but unless things change, you might not be using it. I'll be seeing you around.